Oops, wrong. Hey, this is Amanda Thope from AdvancedNet. Are you the tech moderator for your session or one of the presenters? Oh, I can't hear you. You're still muted.
I'm one of the presenters.
Okay, we'll wait for the moderator to get here. Great. Do you have any questions?
No, I did this yesterday, so
You're good.
yeah, and it went really well. Really
Good. Great. Okay, great.
Okay.
Do you know where any of the other presenters are?
I
Or
don't know, because I have to be in the right place since you're here as well. So
exactly.
I I just checked my email to see, if I got any correspondence about having issues, but I I didn't get anything. I don't know what's going on. Oh, here he is. He just he says yeah, I guess they can't get into the room. What message can what should I
They can't, what,
they can't get into our room.
huh? Are they getting, that's very strange. I will, here, let me get the link for you and you
Yeah.
can send them the link.
And I can
That's,
just, yeah, that'll
yeah,
work.
1 second.
Well, then that must mean other people must be having trouble too, since
Yeah, and I can solve that. You're the examining institutions through textual analysis.
yes. Mhm.
Okay, just wanted to confirm.
Yes.
Okay, I'm putting it in the chat, and then I will, at least we can get the presenters here, and then I'll go try to figure out what's going on in the portal. So, but you can send that to everybody, and then we will keep investigating the problem. So, okay. Did you get into the portal, or did you use that link?
I registered yesterday and I got that link.
And
Like when you,
did you go into the conference portal and click
yes,
on the session?
yes, and I clicked launch, yeah,
Okay.
and it just came up. Okay, so let me send him this information.
And then you can also tell them to go to the chat bubble on the support portal, and somebody can provide help there. And I will also reach out on the back end to support.
Okay.
So, okay,
I'll do
but
that.
they can get in through that, using that at least.
Okay, so I just sent it. I'm glad I checked the email. Are you still there?
Yep. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I need to admit them. I apologize. I was trying to I was trying to troubleshoot, and so I moved away from the window. So,
No problem.
hello, Christopher, you're on mute. So,
Thanks. How you all doing?
Hello.
Hello.
what
Hi.
problem? Hi, this is Amanda Thode with AdvancedNet. What problem were you having getting into the session?
Yeah, when I signed in, when I went through my NCOPS login, the conference login, it was putting me into a different panel. It was putting me into the race and democracy in post-Trump America. And so if I clicked on the schedule and I went down to examining institutions through textual analysis and I clicked that link, then it puts me to race and democracy in post-Trump America.
Oh, okay. All right. I will go try to look into that and get back to you. Christopher, I'm gonna go ahead and make you host for this.
Okay.
And then I'm gonna go investigate that problem. So I will be, or I'll either come back or somehow get a message to you. So, okay.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
All right, thanks.
I'll share this with you all. Yeah, that was weird. I was clicking and then I jumped into a panel. I was like, there's none of the panelists are here. And then I went back and looked at the title. There's a totally different title. And then I was like freaking out. You may explain why. Yeah, what's going on? Were you able to, when you clicked on the link, it automatically brought you in here?
Yeah, I registered for it yesterday and it automatically brought me here. And I was sitting here and I'm like, okay, I can't be in the wrong place because the tech person is here. So what's going on?
Well, I was a little bit late, so yeah, my problem wasn't the platform.
Well, it worked out.
Maybe a third paper. I could not find the author's email address, so I never was able to make contact with the third author on our panel. And so we have a lot of time. We could also wait a minute or two to see if other people were able to get in, if they fixed the technical problem, if there was a technical problem, and then get started with papers. Which I enjoyed reading a lot. Thanks so much for sending them my way.
Yeah, as I told you, I'm sorry because my work was in Portuguese, so I would rather write everything again in English than translate because it's so difficult to translate, but I had to translate last minute, so I'm sorry.
Oh, well, that makes it even more impressive. How's the conference been for you, Floyd?
For me, it's a little bit of a struggle because I'm in Brazil right now, so I have to, it's right in the lunchtime, you know?
Yeah.
And with house, of course, everything during this pandemic, we have to do a lot of things in the house and work at the same time. So, but it's been really good.
Yeah, it was good so far. To me, it's, except for today, everything has sort of flowed flawlessly. Yesterday, I was a moderator for another panel. It's been good.
Oh, nice.
So this is Amanda Thoe with AdvancedNet. So there was a problem with that link, obviously, in the portal. So that link has been updated, and also too in the chat, I did send the. Is it still there?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, I don't know, my chat's being weird. Okay, so they have that link that's in the chat that would let people in directly. So it is fixed now, and I apologize. You know, there were many sessions, and you know, we made just probably a copy and paste error. So I do apologize for that. So, but it's fixed now in the portal. So anyone going in the portal now will get into the right session. And then you do have that link, the Zoom link, if you want to send that directly to anybody. So
perfect. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Hope I apologize again for that. So
no problem.
Okay.
I guess we'll wait a second. Let's see.
Oh, and but I would tell you that, you know, I would wait maybe just a few minutes, but then,
Okay.
you know, if you do go ahead and do your presentations, we'll have the recording, and then they will be able to use the recording in the future. So even, I'm sorry, even if other people don't attend, I would encourage you to go ahead and do it, and then it would be recorded, and then it could be used later.
Perfect. Yep.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I will say having an actual person help you navigate is really nice.
True.
Well, maybe we'll wait till 20. It's 8. Oh, I'm in the West Coast, so it's 8:25 now. Maybe we'll wait to 8:28. Does that seem okay? 3 more minutes?
Okay.
So what time is it in Brazil?
It's 1 in the afternoon, 1:25.
Okay.
So you're in the West Coast?
In
Yes.
Oregon, it is yeah, it's 8 o'clock here, 8:25. It's a little early. I have 2 little kids, so I'm usually up super early anyway. I was up today at 6:30. And how are things in Florida, Natasha?
It's great. It's starting to feel like summer, unfortunately. I would have preferred the cool weather a little longer, but it's great.
And you're in Jacksonville? Is that where?
Jacksonville.
Nice. Someone I went to grad school with, Josh Gellers, I think is.
Yeah, he's in my department. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Wait about 1 more minute and then we'll get started. So we can go in the order of the program unless you have either of you have a preference to go first or second. So that'll be Natasha first, Tassie second.
Okay, no problem.
And Fallon, if she shows up, and she go first, but I'm not sure if she'll be. I think you both have the ability to share your screen too. If you want to. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to our panel entitled Examining Institutions Through Textual Analysis. We have 2 fantastic papers I was fortunate enough to read. And so we have a decent amount of time, but maybe about aim for no more than 20 minutes, and hopefully it'll be well less than that. But we have a lot of time for you to go through your work. And so we'll go in the order on the schedule, and that will start with Natasha Christie from University of North Florida.
Great. Thank you, Christopher. And let me see if I can share my screen. Yes, I can. Okay, thank you. I want to present some preliminary research that I've been working on textual analysis of presidential responses to the murder of George Floyd. And just to give just a tiny bit of background as to how this came about. For the past year, I'd been working on a paper looking at how Obama responded to some of these deaths during his presidency. And in thinking about that, of course, while I'm writing the paper, the incident with George Floyd happened. And I was reading a New York Times article, and it presented the transcripts from all of the from the presidents that responded to this event. And it just got me thinking, I wonder how their responses were shaped, and why, like, what was it about this particular event that got all of the presidents to start, really talking about these issues and really bringing them to the forefront versus, some of the events that happened during Obama's administration. So the focus of this paper is really looking at the presidential responses to the death of George Floyd and trying to create a framework so that we can examine how they actually responded to those events. Excuse me. So in looking through the work, so I looked at statements and remarks from candidate Biden, President Trump, former presidents Bush, Clinton, and Obama. So looking at because they all responded in some way to the murder of George Floyd. So looking at their responses and looking at their responses, I'm trying to figure out, well, how did they respond? How were those responses similar? How were they different? And then another overarching question is looking at what methods they use to inform sort of our morality moral aspects of our national identity. How did they speak to that in their words and in their responses, excuse me, to that event? So that's sort of the two main purposes of the research and the way that I focused what I was looking at here. So again, this is just, preliminarily what I've come up with. I'm going to share with you all. So first, we want to think about, okay, why is it so important? There is a vast amount of literature talking about presidents and their rhetoric. And it's important for us in these ways for a couple of reasons. First, the president has the power to shape events and how we as the audience are influenced by those events. And that's extremely important. And we saw that becoming a lot more important with the events of January 6th of this year, how the president's words are just so important and how they influence others. The other aspect of that is understanding. They can help us to understand confusing and tragic events. And the last part of it is really looking at identifying an event. So something as simple as having a president mention an issue to the public is enough to sort of heighten the public's attention to the problem. And it's not to say that the public may not have been aware, but the fact that the president is talking about it, has identified it as an issue, is important. And it's something that, that we need to just pay attention to and to look at as well. So that's just sort of guiding the understanding of the project. Excuse me. So in looking at that, the literature identifies some of the ways that presidents usually react in times of national tragedy. And they've termed them sort of mourners in chief. So as mourners in chief, the public looks to our leaders to respond and to help us to make sense of the event. So they take on the role of mourner in chief in that way. And the type of rhetoric they use is epideictic rhetoric, in which they explain the troubling event, framing it around shared values. So the idea of talking about the event around shared values is to create some sort of commonality amongst the audience so that we can all relate to what it is that they're talking about. And this is where the idea of moral truths comes out in this type of rhetoric. So as I mentioned, the data that I looked at, again, I was focusing a lot on that New York Times article that presented the transcripts of, she presented the transcripts of Donald Trump's remarks and Joe Biden's remarks and Barack Obama's statements. I got the statements for George Bush and Clinton from their presidential websites, but I've got transcripts of all of those. So again, looking at those transcripts, I'm looking for specific things. So, so what am I looking for? So doing the descriptive content analysis, and based on the slides that I showed you earlier that I was talking about, sort of definition, understanding, identification, I tried to find those things within those texts. So in doing that, I looked at whether or not how they named the event, how they defined the event, and in defining the event, I'm talking about how they described what happened. Did they bring into account what we call our moral truths? And some of examples of moral truths are, did they talk about integrity, faith, honesty, trust, justice, compassion, those sort of things that hit at us as human beings and our moral character, so to speak. And then in understanding the event, did they provide enough context for us to be able to really understand what happened? Did they provide us some background information, some contextual information to help us understand what happened? Excuse me. And then lastly, prescriptions. Did they give us any information on how we can move forward as a nation from this? How we can move forward? What are the sort of the next steps that are going to take place? So in looking through all of those documents, I was looking for those specific things. And some of the things I thought about, like naming the event, for example, excuse me, the more precisely the president names the event, the more likely we are to understand what actually happens. And the more likely we are to understand how they define it, how they decided to talk about it. So all of these things, the more precisely they talk about it, the more likely they are to get in touch and to tap into that side of their audience. So even in describing the event, defining it, the vividness and accuracy with which they describe it will give us some insight into how they saw it as well. Not only how we should interpret it, but how they saw those particular events. And the more likely the speaker is going to be bonded with the audience in that respect. So a couple of things, excuse me, before I go into the sort of the findings. So I just started playing around with the speeches, did a couple of word clouds and for each of their responses. Biden's response was by far the largest with 776 words. And this kind of makes sense because he was campaigning at the time. So that much of that was a driving force with this and some of the things he talked about. And some of the words he tended to use most often, like I've got it's and weave and those types of things. And again, this is just sort of a first look at just looking at the data. For a little further on, I'd love to look at this in context and do some more analysis on this, but just giving you an idea of some of the things they talked about the most in each of theirs. This is Trump's response here in the word cloud regarding Trump. Here's Obama, Bush, and Clinton. And I'll go back a bit to here. So I want to start with talking about, naming the event. How did they go about naming the event? So I think of this as going sort of from sort of the more vivid naming to sort of abstract naming. So if we think of death is sort of abstract in the sense, as the audience, we can interpret death many different ways. Then we'll move on from there to a little less abstract, where Trump states, he says it was a terrible event, terrible things, terrible situation. Then we have an act of brutality. Biden mentioned an act of brutality. And then George W. Bush used the word suffocation. And to me, that was sort of the most vivid description, the most vivid naming of what actually happened in that event. And by naming it in that way, the audience can all sort of envision suffocation and what, at a cellular level, what that could possibly feel like in sort of naming that event. So in my understanding of it, I would have to say that George W. Bush did the best in terms of naming that event, but they all did name the event in some way, but the most concrete naming, of course, was through George Bush's description of the event. So then in defining the event, telling us exactly sort of what happens there in defining the event. And I think here I want to read a couple of the excerpts here for you. So every president except for Trump provides detailed descriptions of what actually happened, right? So for example, Obama defines the event as George Floyd dying face down on the street under the knee of a police officer in Minnesota. Clinton said, in the days since George Floyd's death, it's impossible not to feel for his family and anger, revulsion, and frustration that his death is the latest in a long line of tragedy and injustice, and a painful reminder that a person's race still determines how they will be treated in nearly every single aspect of their lives. George W. Bush, Laura and I are anguished by the brutal suffocation of George Floyd and disturbed by the injustices and fear that suffocate our country. It remains a shocking failure that many African Americans, especially young African American men, are harassed and threatened in our own country. And just to give you an example from that, and this is where sort of Trump defined the event as a terrible event, as sort of a terrible thing. He doesn't really push it, past that in terms of talking about it. So the next thing I look at here is their use of moral truths. So in thinking about their moral truths, how do they try to create a shared understanding of the event by tapping into our morality? So in doing that, I look particularly at a couple of moral truths. I look at humanity, values, virtue, national conscience, compassion, righteousness, and justice, and examine these texts and look for evidence of those sort of moral truths. And in doing that, Biden and Bush relied the most on moral truths. Every single one of the texts did have some sort of mention of a moral truth, one of the moral truths that I've just mentioned. But Bush and Biden relied the most on moral truths in their discussion of the murder of George Floyd. And every president used compassion. So every single one did tap into that moral truth of compassion. But other than that, they seemed to vary a little bit. And I've got some examples here. I'm just not sure if I can, let's see if we can make sense of them here. So for example, here it says for Biden, looking at compassion, he says, every day African Americans go about their lives with constant anxiety and trauma, wondering who will be next. And just sort of talking about that, I've got, and in terms of compassion, Trump says, I understand the hurt. I understand the pain. People have really been through a lot. Obama says, but we have to remember that for millions of Americans, being treated differently on account of race is tragically, painfully, and maddeningly normal. Whether it's dealing with the healthcare system or interacting with the criminal justice system or jogging down the street or just watching birds in a park. George W. Bush, the only way to see ourselves in a true light is to listen to the voices of so many who are hurting and grieving. And Clinton, in the days since George Floyd's death, it is impossible not to feel grief for his family, and anger, revulsion, and frustration that his death is the latest in a long line of tragedy and injustice, and a painful reminder that a person's race still determines how they will be treated in nearly every aspect of American life. So in talking about, let me go back. So that's how they sort of tapped at those moral truths and those moral things that we as a nation should share, as a human beings should share. And then the next thing I look at is the context. Do they explain the underlying factors behind this event, and how do they do that? So everyone except for Trump acknowledged that the role of systemic racism and how the part that it played in what happened to George Floyd. And I think Biden refers to it as our country's original sin and how it still stains our country today. Clinton's, I do want to read Clinton's response here in terms of giving some context to the response. He says, no one deserves to die the way George Floyd did. And the truth is, if you're white in America, the chances are you won't. That truth is what underlies the pain and the anger that so many are feeling and expressing. That the path of an entire life can be measured and devalued by the color of one's skin. 57 years ago, Dr. King dreamed of a day when his 4 little children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Today, that dream seems even more out of reach, and we'll never reach it if we keep treating people of color with the unspoken assumption that they're less human. If George Floyd had been white, handcuffed, and lying on the ground, would he be alive today? So all of the presidents, like I said, except for Trump, did acknowledge that this was more than just one event, that there was more going on behind this event. And as a country, we need to understand the role of systemic racism. And for the most part, they did address that. In the last part that I look at are their prescriptions. How do they foresee us moving forward and presenting some solutions to this event and to events like this? And here it's really important that we look again at looking at from that abstract to that concrete point of view. Because again, the more concrete these prescriptions are, the more likely we are to believe as people that these things can actually come about and happen and be put into effect. So Biden and Clinton provide the most concrete prescriptions here. Biden specifically calls for police reform. Clinton says we need change from the top down here. Clinton says we can't honestly answer these questions in the divide and conquer, us versus them, shift the blame and shirk the responsibility world we're living in. People with power should go first, answer the questions, expand who's us and shrink who's them, accept some blame and assume more responsibility. But the rest of us have to answer these questions as well. Biden says, just point blank, he says we need real police reform to hold cops to a higher standard that so many of them actually meet, that holds bad cops accountable and repairs relationships between law enforcement and the community they're sworn to protect. We need to stand up as a nation with the Black community, with all minority communities, and come together as one America. So in looking at all of this, so what sort of where are we now, sort of what do we do with this information? And sort of what do I do with this information going forward with this project? So a couple of things. So just looking at this information preliminarily, it showed that our leaders were indeed affected by this event in very much the same ways as most of us were affected when we witnessed those events. And I think that's important to acknowledge. They all condemned the event, but they did so in very different ways. Some took more of a sort of abstract view, while others provided vivid accounts of the event and their understanding of why it took place and how they see us moving forward from here. Overall, Biden and Bush seem to have taken the approach of talking about the event in the most concrete ways as compared to the others. And again, I've got to look into sort of why that is. And I've got some other ideas I'm mulling about in that area as well. Clinton and Obama favored sort of more of an abstract and idealist approach for the most part. And Trump provided the most abstract presentation of all of these events. So either way, there's something to be said of a leader who's going to talk about this tragic event in a very concrete way that's going to relate to all of us. So that's sort of what I've concluded so far, just in this part of the analysis. I've got some things that I'm thinking about going further into the analysis, maybe some comparisons, looking at, because I just worked on the Obama paper, looking at some of these same situations, maybe looking at how they responded to these situations while they were in office versus their responses to this situation right now, and to see if there was a different approach there. And then possibly adding some deeper contextual analysis of this information and adding in some quantitative data possibly. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Natasha. All right. Now, Elsie is next. And she is I'm going to mispronounce this horribly, but you're at the University Federal de Pernambuco?
Yes.
Sorry.
It's no problem. I am from Brazil, and I have finished my PhD political science at Universidade Federal de Pernambuco, which is in northeast of Brazil, just to give a context. But I have visited SUNY at Albany in New York, and my co-advisor there was Matthew Ingram. So he helped me a lot with this research too. I'm going to try to share. So I believe you can see it. Okay. So my work, that's actually my dissertation. And right now I'm putting out there just to try to improve it before publishing the results. So of course, I'm going to write down everything that you can collaborate and give to me. But basically, I have analyzed some decisions around the social security policies made by the Brazilian Supreme Court, which we call STF, just to be easier. And I'm going to walk you through some of the chapters of the dissertation. So the introduction of basically the problem of this research was, what is the Brazilian Supreme Court STF role in resolving social disputes after 1988? Just so you know, 1988 is the year that our new, of course, quote unquote, constitution was approved. The goal was to comprehend what is the STF's role in resolving social disputes in the new democratic era. And it is important to understand STF's role in the public policy decision-making process, since the court is constantly asked to revise laws in this matter. It's actually the STF's right now, especially, they are always into politics and deciding about politics. So it is important to know their role. So the first chapter, the first literature review chapter, I gave a little bit of context inside not Latin America, South American only, but because Brazil is inside this context of some kind of pendulum, or we go back and forth into democratic periods and autocratic periods. So right now we are living in a democracy. I pause because of course we are kind of descending on this democracy. But right now we are in a democracy, but before 88, we were under a period of time that we had the military government. And at the end of this chapter, the conclusion was that became rules matter to understand how we got here. And it's important to answer the research question. So we have to understand how we got here, how the Constitution was formed. We had a National Assembly in 1985, 1987, actually, to write the new Constitution. It's a huge Constitution, 250 articles. And a lot of these articles are about public policy. A lot of these articles are also about social rights. So every time that the government has to decide about a new policy or changing some kind of old policy, they have to rewrite the Constitution or write an amendment. And to do that, they need a bigger votes in the Congress. So because we have a different kind of federal system, the president needs a lot of, actually, they need more, sorry if I lose some words, but they need the Congress more than in natural federal systems. They depend on the Congress to change the Constitution, because each vote to change the Constitution is 3/5 of the whole Congress, and they pass twice in each chamber. So on the third chapter, I gave a background about the theory about judicialization of public policies. We have a favorable context for that because we have a huge constitution. We have a lot of public policies, constitutional rights. So the STF is the power, is the court that reviews all these decisions from the legislative and executive branches. Basically, every time that there's a change in the Constitution, the STF can say if it's constitutional or not. And a lot of people, 9 different types of people can ask the STF if the law is constitutional or not. Just, of course, I'm saying that just so you understand a little bit. But there's 2 systems to achieve the STF, to get there. There's the European system. We have the European system, which is some kind of people, some kind of players can ask the STF if a law is constitutional or not. But also we have the American system, what we call American system, that is any person can ask the STF if a law is constitutional or not. For example, myself, if I want to ask the STF if a new law is constitutional or not, I can file an action in the lower system, the judicial system, and it can go up until like the upper court, the last court, which is STF. This is not so easy, but it's possible. So a lot of players can appeal to the STF and can ask the STF if a new law is constitutional or not. That's why they have a lot of appeals to decide every year. When I say a lot, it's in the hundreds of thousands of appeals. So, of course, they built a system that they can decide one case and then decide thousands of cases in the same decision. It was a change in the system in 2005. They did that. And that's what I look into in this research. So I chose this system too, where the STF decides one case, and this case decides hundreds of thousands of cases around Brazil. So the basis for this research was taken from work from Professor Diana Kapches. I'm sorry, I always get her name wrong. I'm sorry. She created this theory, the tactical balancing account theory. She studied the STF and she got into 6 different kind of behaviors that she calls 6 categories of behavior for the STF. And I took these categories to code my decisions, the decisions that I chose, to understand how the STF acts or behaves when they are deciding about social security cases. So the research method was content analysis, but basically the pre-analysis, the first thing that I did was to decide which cases I was going to analyze. So at the end, I got 52 decisions, but I decided to analyze only decisions that were finished, completely finished, which means that it's not possible to ask for an appeal, and decisions that they had viewed all the case, because it's a little bit difficult to explain if you don't have a law background and if you don't know Brazilian system, but basically they can answer each one of the ministers. We call minister, not justices, but each one can decide the case But this decision can receive an appeal. And also they can decide together, like the whole court decides. And this decision, when the whole court decides, cannot have an appeal, cannot get an appeal after. So that second one was the one that I decided to analyze, because basically the whole system is have to follow this decision. The whole judicial system is obliged to follow this decision, the last call decision, let's say. And also the executive and the legislative. The way that the legislative has to overturn the SF decision is to create a new law, of course, just as in the US. But before they create a new law, they have to follow SCF's decision. So I quoted all the decisions following the behavior categories, and I'm going to show you. I have here. So the categories are basically principled, pragmatic, support building, differential, preference-driven, and self-protective. Principled, the category principled means that the STF, deciding that case, decided to follow the rule, the law as it is, as the words exactly say. Pragmatic is basically a behavior that the STF has when they are concerned about the consequences of that decision, when they think about how that decision is going to impact the budget, or if the decision is going to impact the political department, if it's going to have a big political impact. Basically, two types of concern, a political concern or an economical concern. And support building means that they are preoccupied with the public opinion. So they want to build their image with the public. Differential is when they say in the decision that they are going to let the legislative decide about that, or they are going to let the executive decide about that. So they take a step back and say, no, that's not for us to decide about that. That's for the other branches. Preference driven is when they say in the decision that they have to protect. Actually, no. Preference driven is when they we know in the decision their preferences, ideological preferences. And be self-protective, finally, is when they say that they have to protect themselves, the court, the judiciary system, something like that. So some of the results, I also did a word cloud just to first of all understand a little bit. So it was 52 decisions. So each decision, depending on the case, can go up like 3 pages to 300 pages. I had one, actually, it was more than 300 pages. So I had to clean a little bit the words, but basically you can, they're all in Portuguese, but you can see retirement, their name, Supremo Tribunal Federal, constitution, public, extraordinary, infrastructure, vote, state. But I also wanted to know how many times they mentioned their names, or their names were mentioned in the decisions. And 2 of the names Marco Aurelio and Luis Roberto Barroso stood up like the first two. So one funny thing about the justices, the ministers, is that Marco Aurelio is the minister that we call that we say that he is always against the others. So the one vote against all of the others every time is from Marco Aurelio. So every time he cited at least as the losing vote. And Luis Roberto Barroso was the minister on one of the cases that was this one that I said that it had more than 300 pages. So he was the one that wrote the winning vote. That's why everybody cited him in their votes. And which is another thing that is interesting about the SF and may be different from the American Supreme Court is that our court is, we have 11 ministers, but they all write their votes and they all have their own opinion at the end. So at the end, to win, of course, you have to have the majority, but each vote is based in different opinions. It's not like one vote and someone says if agrees or not. They say if they agree or not, but they can agree in a different basis, or they can disagree and create a new vote, completely new vote. So we usually say it's 11 island together to inside one court. So each minister is a completely different person. You can see that Marco Aurelio stands up. That's the frequency of the names as codes, because I created also a code for ministers, so I could know which one had the most, was the one that participated in most cases. So Marco Aurelio was the one, again, is the one that is always against. So either he was the writing vote, the winning vote, or he was against the winning vote. These are the Constitution amendments that I was looking to, because they changed the Social Security system. We had the first one, 1988, the amendment number 20. We have more than 100 amendments so far, but this one, 1998, was the number 20, and it changed the whole Social Security system. Then we had another one, 2003, the number 41. It again changed the system. The 2005, the number 47, just created, I tried to fill some blanks of the 41, and the number 19 and 70 were just smaller changes. Okay, I'm just finishing. Just the results at the end, I saw that the kind of behavior that's I could see that they were more, that I could see more in my research was, first of all, principled, but of course, every decision has to be based in a law. So I was, at the end, I just thought that it was not really interesting to look into the principled consideration. So I went to the pragmatic as the first consideration, the first kind of behavior that they have. It's really common to read they saying that they are concerned about the budget, how that decision is going to impact the budget. And that's the first conclusion that I had, that the court acts as validator of other branches' policies most of the times when the decision could have a big impact on the budget. However, when it wants to protect its own privilege, the budget's not a concern, so they change the law, and they worry about public opinion and their image in sensitive cases. For example, when they had to decide about maternity pay and leave, so they changed the law. And I hope that you understood a little bit. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. All right, I will give a couple of comments and then we'll open it up if Dr. Franklin has any questions. I'll start with Dr. Christie's paper. This is one I really enjoyed. A lot of my own research is thinking about how elected officials respond to crises and particularly issues around Black Lives Matter. So I have a couple of comments and then suggestions, and hopefully this won't be pushing you in too far of a different direction. One of the things that I've always been interested in is kind of the timing of when speeches come out, right? And so I wonder if that's something that you take into account. I remember when Obama spoke about Trayvon Martin, he had done so after Mitt Romney had already spoken out. And so I wondered if that was something that you were taking into account or thinking about, because the quickness in which someone responds, I don't know if it shows more priority or more empathy. It might signal something to the electorate that matters. And then I was thinking, and so this is something else that might be in addition to the paper, is if there's a comparison category about how the members of the president respond. So there would have to be someone large enough that all the presidents would have put out some type of press release or some speech about. And so my guess is John Lewis was someone who might have warranted that, and he died roughly around the same time. And just to see if there was a comparison in how they responded to John Lewis, who died of more natural causes, compared to George Floyd, who was murdered, right? And so I would be interesting to see that comparison. The other thing, when you talked about compassion, and this made me think a little bit about empathy, right? And so Obama's maybe the only one who can speak to the fact that I know this feeling. And I think about his response to Trayvon Martin, where he said, that could have been my son. And I wanted to know if there were differences, and just seeing some of your quotes that kind of made me think a little bit about that. And so then this made me think of some of the things with your other projects. And so I have a couple of suggestions, both for those and for this, and so they may be worthless. So feel free to disregard them if they are. So there's a program called Linguistics and Word Count, or Sentiment Analysis overall. I don't know if you've done any work with this. So sentiment analysis, and I'd be happy to run this for you if you'd like. You just put in the speeches and you separate it by like paragraph or by sentence or something, and it spits out a bunch of information that psychologists use to measure things, right? So they measure how formal or informal the speech was, and that might be a measure of how serious the elected officials took it. And then it also measures tone. So it measures things like anger, anxiety, sadness. And so it seems like a quick way. Another thing that can be done with this analysis is by taking these speeches and then looking at how the tone shifts toward those particular issues, right? So when Biden or Obama talks about George Floyd and maybe even Trayvon Martin, I don't know, maybe Biden would have as well, he was VP at the time, are they showing more anger than other presidential candidates? Are they more formal and more measured in their responses? So I'll share that information with you, anything you have. And if you want, I'd run it for you. It can be run in R, or there's a program called LIWC, which is like $80. And it just automatically shoots, you put in the Excel file and it shoots out all those things. And then I don't know, I have data. And I'd be happy to give this because I don't know what I'd use it for, but I have Twitter data for all members of Congress. So this moves you outside of the executive, but I'd be happy to share you every tweet that a member of Congress put out about George Floyd, if that could be a useful comparison. And I will have press releases, which will be more formal, but I have to finish setting all that up. But by the beginning of summer, I'll have those things. And I wouldn't do anything specifically with those, with George Floyd press releases or tweets. And so I'd be happy to share that if you wanted to expand it to members of Congress. But yeah, I really enjoyed this paper. And yeah, this is something that I certainly will cite in the future. Natassi's paper, I also enjoyed this. I am far less of an expert of the Brazilian Supreme Court, so I really enjoyed your presentation because it kind of gave me some context to understand what was happening. And so I have a couple of suggestions. Hopefully these will make some sense, and it could be just my misunderstanding of the court. My first thing that I was looking at when I was looking at your different categories, particularly around support building, was the role. So right now you kind of have all the cases aggregated together. I wanted to know if you could separate some of those cases out and see if you could find something there. So for example, could you do something where you showed that cases which had high levels of support differ from cases with low levels of support? And so that's something that I just thought, like, what's the role of public opinion in this? And then the same thing when you mentioned sometimes they're more deferential to the votes in the legislature. How much of that is also driven by that was a vote that was unanimous in the legislature? So there's no way I'm going to go against something that's so popular, because, you know, courts have to worry about their institutional legitimacy. And I'm guessing that may be even more true in a country that vacillates between democracy and an autocracy, that the courts are constantly thinking about their role in the decisions they're making. So that's I guess that's a good segue to my other point, is there a way to measure this change over time as the country is maybe freer and the courts have more autonomy maybe in periods of time where the democracy is stronger? Are they different in the types of things that they talk about? Are they less deferential? Are they more likely to engage in, I think the last comment was preference driven. Are they more likely to engage in preference driven policies? And then this wasn't in the paper, but I think you did a fantastic job talking about this in your presentation, was the difference by court member. So that's one of the things that I thought a lot about too as I was reading this. And I think you did a fantastic job in the presentation. So I'm sure this is in your dissertation and done extremely well there. But that was just something that I thought about. Like, well, what are there differences in court membership? And then some of the more traditional measures of decision making, like ideology, how those things were taken into account. But I think you did that extremely well. So yes, thank you so much for your papers. And Fallon has entered the room.
Yeah, I apologize. I was actually in the wrong room for some reason. But I can do my presentation if there is time. It will take 10 minutes, and I can also answer questions if anyone wants to. But yeah, I could commence now if that's all right.
Is that okay with you, all the other presenters? And then hopefully, I don't know if they kick us out of the room. Hopefully they won't.
Yeah, like I'm cool to just present whatever if everyone's all right with that.
Yeah, I'd like to. Sorry that happened to you. That happened to me too when I signed on. It shot me to a different room.
Okay. All right.
Like
So I will continue. I will share my screen.
Okay.
And view slideshow. Okay. All right. So I'm going to be talking about pretty much just a textual analysis of a movie, New Jack City, and the polity that is conveyed in the cinematic narrative. So yeah, and also thanks again for having me here. So yeah, New Jack City belongs to a cinematic tradition associated with hood as a genre, a cultivation of narratives which express the disenfranchisement, abject poverty, and hustle that distinctly afflict African-American youth and adulthood in the 1980s and 1990s. Sociohistorically, I can attribute these adversities to be the legacy of two factors. One, the high unemployment in the 1970s resultant from the shift in labor demands, locations, and industries in which Black peoples were prominent, in addition to being unable to find work in growing economic sectors due to discrimination and untenable minimum wage. And two, the opioid and HIV/AIDS epidemics of the Reagan era in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan himself embodied conservatism invoked through the ascriptions of classical Hollywood, impersonal productive labor and interpersonal reproductive labor respective to men and women, the former likened to careerism, sexual agency, and indifference, with the latter likened to maternity, sexual chastity, and romance. As an actor, Reagan also appealed to a nostalgia for spectacles and values associated with classical Hollywood, like continuous linear uniform temporal spaces, personae whom accentuate the individual psyche over the collective social, and narratives of canonical cause and effect as opposed to random events. His successful campaigns and ensuing presidential terms comprised a sentimentalist rhetoric that beseeched nostalgia for a time but never was, a time of an idyllic Americana contingent upon white supremacy and a gender binary, omitting the reality that white supremacist aspirations of racial segregation or political and cultural dominion of whites did not prevail over the emancipationist pursuits of the abolishment of slavery, suffrage, citizenship, and constitutional equality for racial minorities. Although the Reagan era lasted from the 1980s to 1990s, the militant romanticism and apologia which underpinned partisans like Reagan and their acolytes is timeless. It counterposes reality. Just as it championed slaverocracy in opposition to abolitionism, it fostered neoliberalism, consigning an inherent competitivity to humanity and redefines people as consumers whose agency and merit is a matter of buying and selling, wherein bootstrapping is avowed and public services are privatized, lest citizens become idle or too dependent upon the state apparatus. A sense of nihilism consequently arose from the low-wage stagnation, poverty, social exclusion, and systemic violence which ensued for marginalized positionalities in urban spaces. Historical stereotypes saw African Americans as mammies, Uncle Toms, sapphires, and mandingos. Contemporary hegemony confers a status of gangdom in line with circumstantial behaviors from the stigma of race, poverty, epidemic drug use and trafficking, and a respective lack of hope for the future. Gangdom on screen serves as a means and end that exalts the vigilantism thematic to Blaxploitation films of the 1970s, wherein white supremacy and bureaucracy rendered judicial systems to be injudicious to Black peoples. The African-American gangster is a casualty of hegemony whose only reproach and refuge against the system are street codes. Their behavioral repertoire shift for the worst. High rates of substance abuse, violence, and criminality during the Reagan era due to increased unemployment and the decline of public services in the wake of rampant neoliberalism. The gangster is painfully aware of how everyone else and they themselves are deprived, which is why they are distrustful, always on guard, and competitive in an effort to seize whatever there is of scarce resources. They are reckless and indulgent, not because they have accepted the impermanence of conditioned things, but because precarity and mortality prevents them from seeing beyond their immediate adversities. Consider the distinction of Black peoples in relation to diagnostic errors and injustice. Samuel A. Cartwright, a physician who practiced in the antebellum South, pathologized the desire of Black enslaved peoples to escape their captivity and their alleged lack of work ethic as drapetomania and dyslexia epideica, respective to the Reconstruction and Emancipation era. These pseudoscientific diagnoses allege that the Black psyche was not innately immoral, but criminal. The ascription of criminality to the Black psyche was a means to justify Jim Crow laws and mass incarceration, the latter of which included psychiatric hospitals in addition to prisons. Civil rights activism was later pathologized as a schizophrenic protest psychosis by psychiatrists who characterized such to include hostile and aggressive feelings and delusional anti-whiteness, whereafter the American Psychiatric Association changed the definition of schizophrenia to specifically include aggression. New Jack City follows drug tycoon Nino Brown, played by Wesley Snipes, and his gang known as the Cash Money Brothers, whom have monopolized the New York City narcotics trade. Under Nino's brutal leadership, his gang cultivates a multi-million-dollar empire. On the other hand, Scotty, played by Ice-T, is a police officer who goes undercover to take Nino down. The film concerns the fictive kinship, a type of bond based on neither blood or marital ties between African-American gangsters. In particular, this fictive kinship concerns siblingship, as characters are mainly brothers whose rivalry evinces strong bonds, street codes, and betrayal. Although pain and violence are constant, it is their incomprehensibility, a lack of clear motive or rationale, that engenders fear. The cudgel of each character in New Jack City is that they engage in a game of optics, not power shifts. Resolute carnage and binary models serve as means and ends in accordance to the behavioral codes which coalesce through Eurocentrism, capitalism, and criminality. What ensues are narratives which impart that liberation cannot and never will occur through besting or assimilating into malignant institutions yielding from the aforementioned. The producers and director of New Jack City assert the film depicts how street justice serves to aid rather than subvert colonialist institutional status quos. They say it serves as a vivid and informed warning, a stylish cautionary tale about the daily devastation caused by drugs and crime in many such communities throughout the country. This distinction is significant as I am cognizant of how the concept of street justice may be purposed to reflect BIPOC autonomy and empowerment in opposition to a colonial hegemonic surveillance state. Street justice can also span protest in the wake of vain or discriminatory judicial sanctions that afflict marginalized positionalities worst, which is evinced in the conjectural misgauge of ailments, actions, and experiences of BIPOC whose adversities are born of and exacerbated by systemic oppression. In New Jack City, we see how peoples of marginalized positionalities whom hold a materialistic worldview that discursively favor Eurocentrism might cultivate a trope of street justice, which is then marauded as a means of resistance to the American penal system. An impetus of resistance is projected upon street justice in New Jack City, which is instrumentalized through the pathology and criminality ascribed to the Black psyche. Street justice in New Jack City depicts how kinship embodies a neoliberal parody. Siblingship stems from a pragmatic nihilism lower social stratums assume in the wake of this parochial dynamic. Fraternity and sorority demarcate a caste. Those whom financialize necessities and proliferate disparities have termed and defined ways they implement the transfer of capital into their own pockets from ignoble judiciaries and insolvent people. Urgency inclines a resolve in characters to make the most of precarious resources until there is nothing left. While shared interests in law enforcement yield institutional kinship, systemic violence fosters a convenient kinship. Institutional kinship manifests not only in the resolve of police officers and judiciaries to incriminate Nino's gang, but additionally in their professional and consequently personal insulation from society at large. They cast themselves as the good guys. They believe there to be a constant power struggle between good guys and bad guys, and that social orders require that the good guys win no matter the cost, hence their every means justify the ends. Although Scotty and his colleagues are posited to embody a moral high ground in their ambition to dissolve Nino's gang and avenge its fatalities, they are also ultimately bound by a shared interest to enforce authority and control. In contrast, Nino and likewise gangsters are bound precariously, even as they ardently proclaim to be my brother's keeper. An avowal of loyalty, a conviction that we bear the responsibility to watch out for our siblings by blood, marriage, choice, or other conditions, should they lack care or wisdom. My brother's keeper is a figure of speech deprived from the infamous siblingship of Cain and Abel in the book of Genesis. While the book of Genesis does not explicitly ascribe responsibility to Cain given his birth order as eldest, it does somewhat foreshadow the formulation by Alfred Adler, a psychoanalyst and contemporary of Freud, which posits that birth order affects personality, notably as elder children tend to assume responsibilities associated with guardianship over youngsters in response to feeling displaced by the arrival of another sibling. Moreover, this generally speaks to how one can liken their sibling as a distinctive threat to their place in the world as opposed to parents, peers, or others. This ensues in New Jack City as the convenience kin of gangsters inevitably devolves. Brothers and sisters project their own distrusts and insecurities, which culminate in a sense of betrayal, then bereavement, as they are augmented by violence and murder. Siblingship magnifies perceived slights or disparities as failures to fulfill responsibilities of honesty, import, and protection. In the absence of actual constancy in conjunction with the marginalized positionalities at play, siblingship here becomes an accelerant for boundary erosion. This siblingship may be coded as something positive in opposition to the undue processes of yore, but this is purely aesthetic. That animosity and carnage is a first resort shows that the siblings in the gang never truly put their money where their mouths are, which reflects how siblingship may be utilized to obfuscate the transactional and hierarchical nature of particular cultures, norms, or value systems. Because loyalty and complacency, however precarious, are most assured if those are convinced not to see the culture, norms, or value systems as transactional or hierarchical at all. And that is the conclusion of my presentation.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Fallon. Fallon, I owe you comments. I wasn't able to find your email address. So if you send me your paper, I'll put my email in the chat. I will certainly read it and then send you some comments. So I apologize for that.
Okay, cool.
Thanks.
That's awesome.
Thanks so much for coming. Sorry that we got like totally mixed up. Any questions or comments from the panelists?
Well, thank you very much for your feedback. I appreciate it. Just delving into the world of qualitative analysis, so that feedback was extremely helpful in terms of guiding me going forward. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and reach out, Natasha, if I can ever help with any of that stuff. Like I've been doing it. I just started doing this like a year or two ago, and so I have a lot of resources. And I don't know if you want to move beyond the presidency, but I have a ton of stuff from Congress. So I have all press releases from basically 2014 all the way to 2020. And so if you're like, oh, I want to talk about a particular issue, I can just do a keyword search and send that stuff your way. And
Perfect. Yeah, I appreciate any feedback, anything you can help me with. I appreciate it.
Yeah, perfect.
I also
just
want
want
to
to say-
thank you.
I wanted to thank you as well for having me as well. But I also wanted to say that the Make American Great Again slogan was actually from Ronald Reagan. Like, that's not something Donald Trump came up with himself. That was why I was talking about the Reagan era in my presentation, because, and then I chose New Jack City because like that was a film that reflected the direct consequences of like that administration and the legacy that continues to be perpetuated as a result of that. But I was surprised about that. Make America Great Again was something Ronald Reagan said in his speech when he was campaigning. That wasn't something Donald Trump or his camp came up with. And I think that they invoked that whole classical Hollywood nostalgia when marketing and championing like whatever ideals that he was professing to encapsulate to make America great again. So it's interesting how that stuff kind of like, it's just timeless and it just continues.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I did not know that. I did not know that connection.
Yeah, I just want to thank you. Thank you for your comments. I hope that maybe I can publish something more in details and share with you if you want.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, if I can help with anybody's project, feel free to reach out. Yeah, I'm happy to do so. Like I found all of these projects really interesting. Even though, yeah, some are further outside of my field, I really enjoyed it. It was really fantastic. I really lucked out at this conference, like being in the panels I'm put in, because the papers have been so interesting. That's not always the case. Yeah, I don't know if I'm not on LinkedIn, but I will check Fallon. I'm on. What's your email, Fallon? Could you put in the email in the chat? And then I'll email you right now. Oh, perfect. Awesome. Well, does anyone have any other comments they'd like to make before we break? All right, if not, thank you all so much for a wonderful
Thank
presentation.
you.
And yes, I hope we keep in
Yeah.
touch. See
Will
you.
do. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.